Hello, chess fans. Today, I'm excited to show you a game between Paul Keres and William Winter. This game was played in 1935 at the Warsaw Olympiad. This was a pretty famous game, and this game and tournament helped establish Paul Keres' reputation as one of the strongest up-and-coming players of the next generation. His opponent in this game is William Winter. William Winter was a British champion in the 1930s and is the answer to the trivia question you probably never asked: which British champion is the only one to have been imprisoned? The answer is William Winter, and it's because he was a member of the Communist Party at a time in which that was particularly not acceptable in British society. Getting into the game, Paul Keres opens with the move pawn to e4, and William Winter chooses to respond with the move pawn to c5. We get a Sicilian defense. Now you're thinking, yes, excitement. I like Sicilians, right? And you would be absolutely correct, except you're not going to get a typical open Sicilian. Knight c6 is played by William Winter. This move was kind of popularized by Aaron Nimzowitsch, but it is one of the moves from Nimzowitsch that does not really stand the test of time. This move has often been considered dubious, and I think that evaluation is probably correct. But we will see an attempt to revive this move by Shakhryar Mamedyarov in a moment. So after knight f6, Keres pushes on with pawn e5. Correct, the knight should be disturbed. The knight steps to d5, and it is challenged by knight c3. Of course, black has no interest in exchanging and helping white develop and gain control in the center of the board. Instead, black is going to play the move pawn to e6. Now, in this position, first, I want to mention one random line that's kind of funny. One move that you might consider here is knight e4. Knight e4 makes a lot of sense because you're trying to establish control over these dark squares, which are weakened by black's e6 and c5 moves. This is probably not the strongest move, but it is interesting, and a strong response from black is the move pawn to f5. I'm not going to analyze this further. Suffice to say that it is a very interesting position with chances for both sides. And just looking at this position, you can appreciate how the players might just enjoy playing a position like this that's so fresh and original, as opposed to other lines and common openings that are a little bit more played out and give rise to less dynamism. Jumping back, after e6, Keres chooses to capture on d5, which is correct. Pawn takes d5. And this looks like a strong center for black, but you should try to strike at it right away with pawn d4. The attempt to exchange the pawn on c5 is likely to leave black with weak dark squares. Now, after the move, there are two choices here. Slow down for a moment. After the move knight c6, not played in the game, we reach the game Wesley So versus Shakhryar Mamedyarov. Now, d takes c5, bishop takes c5 is the main line, but the critical line is not what Wesley So played, bishop d3. Mamedyarov equalized relatively easily after bishop d3. However, So could have played queen takes d5, the main line, the most common move, and certainly the most challenging move. I'm really curious why Wesley So did not play this move against Mamedyarov, and why Mamedyarov went for this line and offered this pawn sacrifice, allowing the queen to capture on d5. There's a couple of really sharp lines here, and I want to show them briefly and challenge the viewers out there to see if they can find a line for black that gets to equality or something like a playable position, because I can't really find it. In this position, after the queen captures on d5, there seem to be two moves. The first is queen b6. And queen b6 is really interesting. It attacks the f2 pawn. The thing is, white can let that pawn go. Bishop c4, the pawn gets captured, the king steps up to e2, the strongest square. You want to keep this bishop under fire because it can get into trouble. Black should castle here. White plays rook f1, threatening the bishop, which should now retreat. And then there's the move knight to g5 with a big attack on f7. Missed this arrow over here. Okay. Even though white lost f2, that doesn't seem to have been a big problem because the king is kind of safe on e2 at the moment. but white's attack on f7 is really strong. Now, black can keep the position from getting, very checkmatey, which could happen if you played a bad move here. But all the resulting positions do seem quite favorable to me for white. Now, an exciting move is knight takes e5 here. This is super cool, a very interesting possibility from Stockfish. If the queen captures on d5 or an e5, pawn d5 is really strong. And the position is at least unclear. White is now up a piece, but bishop g4 is coming, a rook is coming to e8, and white's king really is not very safe, and black's king is seemingly safe enough. You can dig into that position more, but at least it's interesting, and I can see Mamedyarov wanting to play a position like that. However, after knight takes e5, the stronger move is not capturing the knight, but simply playing knight takes f7, and after knight takes, rook takes, to avoid getting mated on this diagonal, you have to trade queens. And the resulting endgame does not seem good for black at all. You have 3 pawn islands to 2, and your king is going to be in the greater difficulties in this position. I can't think at the highest level that this would be the end result of anyone's best line of analysis. No one would really want to play this definitely worse endgame where you're really going to suffer and you might not be able to save it. Backing the position up though, instead of knight takes e5, it is possible to play knight d4 check, and then after the king moves, you can stuff the attack on f7 by sticking your knight on e6. Maybe this is playable for Mamedyarov, but white is up a pawn. White has great pieces. The king's position on d1 does not seem to be too much of a problem, so I still strongly favor white in this position. If we jump back, there is an alternative. Instead of this move queen b6, it is possible to play d6 right away. And after d6, white isn't going to be able to build up the same pressure on f7, partly because of bishop to e6. So let's say you capture on d6, then black can play queen b6 now, attacking f2. And a computer line that's very interesting here is queen e4 check, bishop develops, queen h4 to defend f2 from this side of the board and to support an attack on the king after castles bishop d3. I think the resulting position is favorable for white, and white is close to a clean pawn up. All of this suggests to me that this line really isn't playable, but if you can find an improvement in this line or show that one of these end positions I got to is actually viable for black, then maybe the Nimzovich variation can be kind of resuscitated. As it is, though, I think it's probably pretty bad, and certainly what happened to Winter is something that no one would wish on themselves voluntarily. Jumping back here, instead of Mamedyarov's knight c6, Winter played the move pawn to d6, and things get really bad in a hurry. So after pawn to d6, we get bishop to g5. Also bishop to b5 check is pretty good. And Winter plays queen to a5 check. Keres plays pawn to c3, and Winter captures on d4. Now, this is a good position to pause your video and ask yourself how you would continue if you were Paul Keres in this position. So there's a few good moves. One bad move is knight takes d4, because after pawn takes e5, black center is great and your knight's getting evicted. But we can improve on this idea of capturing with the knight on d4, and the knight would be very good on d4, by throwing the move pawn e6 in. Now black seems to need to capture on e6. You don't want to allow this capture on f7. But after both captures on e6, the knight getting to d4 seems pretty good. Even though black is a pawn up in this position, white's position is excellent, and the doubled pawns are really more of a problem for black than they are any kind of benefit. Also, fe6, knight takes d4, is going to give white very good and rapid attacking chances after the bishop develops and he castles his king. White's advantage is pretty clear here, and you should really be tempted by white's attacking prospects here. Jumping back, I do like this move e6 very much, But Keres also finds a good attacking move. He plays the move bishop to d3 with no interest in guarding the c3 pawn, an interest simply on developing and castling. Winter chooses to capture on c3, and now Keres simply castles again, daring black to be greedy and capture more pawns while he builds his attack. This is a great moment to pause your videos again and see how you would defend if you were playing Paul Keres and you had to try to survive the coming onslaught. The correct continuation seems to be knight c6. You're developing a piece and you're threatening to capture on e5. White should play rook e1 here, defending e5 and getting ready to capture with check. Now the move bishop e6 is a pretty good move, and the capture on b2 starts to really be potent because black is well developed enough now to hold off a very direct onslaught. So now it makes sense for white to capture on c3, and black should not be, more greedy at this point. Black needs to try to survive, pull the queen back, threaten again on e5, and after white now captures and the bishop captures, black is finally mobilized enough, having been very focused on mobilization in the last few moves, to be able to castle next turn. And black seems to be able to get away with an okay position, although both knight d4 and bishop f5 probably win a pawn back on e6 and keep a very interesting position for both players. Jumping back, after white castled, Winter did continue with the greediest possible move. He captures on b2. Now, this is a classic thing that your chess coach is going to tell you, like, never ever do. Never get greedy and keep capturing pawns in the opening, right? Sometimes great players do violate the rules, but this is a great example of why the rules, are in place. This kind of greed usually gets punished. In this position, I want you to pause your video for a moment, try and figure out what you would play to attack as white and punish this kind of greed from black. I mean, black has only developed the queen. All of the minor pieces are undeveloped, and black is still several moves away from castling. And it's not easy to castle because the only bishop development simply allows for the bishop to be captured. So, if you've paused your video and figure out what you're going to do, the best move is queen c2. Now, Keres simply moved his rook. That was fine. But this move threatens to take the bishop and give checkmate after the queen blocks. So this is a super strong move. And after knight c6, we can move this attacked rook with a gain of time over to e1. The fact that we lock in this rook for a moment isn't going to matter because we've got so much firepower mobilized already. This rook will get into play in time, but we may not even need it to finish off our attack. Instead, Keres simply moved his attacked rook over to b1 after the capture on b2. This is still very good. His position is great in this case. Black captures on e5, and the knight captures on e5. Now, maybe for a moment, if you've been doing like Puzzle Rush, you might go, ooh, tactic, pawn fork, but hopefully you immediately realize that you should never play f6. And in this case, simply queen h5 check would win the game very quickly for white. I'm not even going to analyze the continuations after queen h5 check. At this point, like, your senses should be tingling. You should be going, this is a crushing attack. I can't allow this. And you would be right to think that way. You can calculate further if you want to. After knight takes e5, black tried to move bishop to d6. Maybe the move bishop b4 was better for reasons we're going to see in a moment. But even in that case, white's attack is very strong. I don't think black should be able to save the day. So pause your videos and figure out what you would play here as white. Did you pause your videos yet? If not, I can wait some more because I really recommend taking some time and figuring out the best continuation. So in this position, black's next move, if black can get away with it, is castling. And if black gets away with it, then black is pretty much fine and could even soon be better, right? Time matters in a case like this. White is well mobilized and castled, but if you let black castle, that kind of advantage just poof, goes away. So the strong move here for white, the only winning move for white, is knight takes f7, a knight sacrifice to keep the black king exposed when white's queen, bishops, and rook are going to quickly overwhelm black. This basically wins on the spot. Now, black has to capture this knight. If this bishop weren't on d6, but were instead on b4, black could try castling here, which is kind of a funny move. But in this case, with the bishop hanging on d6, it's not possible. So, black does capture with the king. White has queen h5 check now, and none of the king moves are good. But I will take a moment to look at king f8. If you go to the e-file, rook to e1 should of course win, right? And if you go to g8, then there's a queen check and the bishop hangs. But what about king to f8? This move definitely looks like the most resilient, even though it does not save the game. In this position, white should play the rook to e1. There's a big threat of mate here on e8 with either the rook or the queen. The most natural move is bishop d7, developing and defending that threat. And then simply lifting the rook creates an unstoppable and winning threat of rook f3 check. Black's king will not be able to hold on. It's just about mate in a few moments. Black can only avoid checkmate by just discarding pieces left and right, and even then it's probably still mate. So, backing up, after queen h5 check, black played the move pawn to g6. I don't even think you need to pause your videos here. You should quickly see that bishop takes g6, pawn takes, and queen takes rook is very, very strong here. Now, this is a position where some people might instinctively think that even though white's tactics have kind of paid off, maybe the attack isn't that good because black gave some material back, but, if black could mobilize these pieces, then white's, attack on the king could be stopped, right? The material advantage, the material situation isn't so bad for black, right? The problem is you're really not able to hold all the threats together for black. Queen f6 is the biggest threat. It'll win the bishop on d6. But queen f6 will also pick up the pawn on g6. There's also the possibility of queen h7 check. And simply a rook to the e-file creates tremendous threats like queen to e8 check. It's all simply too strong. Black tries the move bishop f5, developing the bishop and attacking the rook on b1. Keres finds a nice move. He plays his rook over to e1, cutting off this king's attempts to flee to the queen side. Now, in this position, if bishop takes b1, there's simply mate after queen check and bishop h6. So Winter tries the move bishop e4, trying to shut down the e-file and give his king some room to run. Keres finds a nice continuation here. Rook takes e4, pawn takes e4, and queen f6 check. And this was enough to cause William Winter to resign. In this case, if the king goes to e8, there's simply queen check, and this is forcing mate. If the bishop blocks, of course queen takes his mate. And if the king moves over, bishop h6 is really a very pretty kind of checkmate. I've always appreciated this queen and bishop combination, and it's a fairly common checkmate that you should remember. If the king goes to g8 instead, of course this hangs, but we can pick that up with check after queen takes g6. We're going to be able to pick the bishop up with check. You can't go here because of mate, by the way. And our attack is going to continue. We can at any point choose to regain material, but the queen and bishop checks coming will end the game really, really quickly. Black's king is totally exposed, and Winter did not need to see the finish from Paul Keres. The computer even announces mate in 9. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I think it's a really nice game from Paul Keres to show an attack on an uncastled king, the importance of time early in the game, and of course classic concepts like rook lifts and development and the punishment of greed, among other things. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like on YouTube or on Facebook or wherever you're watching, and consider sharing it with a friend that you think might also like this video. Thanks so much, and have a great day.